Donald Trump ally Elon Musk's call for there to be tariff-free trade between the USA and Europe. That's the top story in the Metro. Meanwhile, the international edition of the Financial Times says Trump officials have dismissed concerns about the damaging effect of tariffs on the markets and are pressing on regardless. The Telegraph hails the possible return of medical house calls carried out by what it calls an army of health workers as a way of easing pressure on the NHS. The Mail, meanwhile, says 9 out of 10 GPs want an NHS prostate cancer screening programme, which could save hundreds of lives a year. The Mirror warns British tourists that they face a summer of protests if they visit Spain, amid growing anger at a housing crisis there, which is being blamed on tourism. The Express claims victory in a campaign to get government financial help for British service veterans with the cost of getting to VE Day events abroad. And finally, the Star leads with an expected Easter heatwave. That would be lovely. And we are joined tonight by Tim Montgomerie and Zoe Grunewald. Thank you both so much for being with us. Obviously, this is the Sunday after the week of Liberation Day, and we're still seeing all the developments. Let's start with the Financial Times, and of course, we'll bring in that breaking news that we had about the car manufacturing industry. Headline here, Trump officials dismiss market rout and vow to press on with punishing tariffs. Tim, let's start with you. Tell us about the story, but also people always say, you know, Trump can often change his mind, but here it seems that he's not going to change his mind about many tariffs.
Well, people will think that I'm a real saddo for this, but I was at a dinner party with friends the other night, and we actually broke off our dinner party to watch Trump's announcement. We're such fun in solitary. Yeah. But actually, it was not me that initiated it. But what struck me as I watched him that night was he made it such a big deal. You know, it wasn't just one of his famous writings of his black marker pen on an executive order. He had the American flag behind him, and he made this a very, very big commitment. This was going to be a day in history. So my sort of heart sank as I was listening to this, because he's made it such a big deal now. It's much harder for him to retreat from a policy that I think is very dangerous. And the FT's report for tomorrow's international edition makes it clear that they are pressing ahead, and they're saying the officials around Trump are saying a loss in the stock market doesn't mean a loss in the economy. And what their argument is, I'm not sure it particularly works, but they are saying that, yes, American companies who've invested abroad, they're losing value because their model is being challenged by the new American administration's policy. So, for the time being, no sign of any U-turn.
OK, Zoe?
Yeah, I mean, some might say this is Donald Trump being defiant. Others might say it is an example of his team sticking their fingers in their ears and refusing to see what's right there in front of them. I mean, there is plenty of evidence here that what we are going to see are retaliatory tariffs. We're going to see the effect of the shock of this echoing around the world. You know, people who are looking at their pensions losing value, people who are worried about the price of eggs, you know, things like that.
Always eggs in America.
There's always eggs. All of these things are going to be affected, and it's deeply troubling, not just for people in the US, people in the UK, but all these countries that are poorer countries that are going to be most impacted by this. You know, for example,
they got
Vietnam.
massive tariffs.
Yes, I know, and because of this trade surplus by which the tariffs were calculated. So we don't really know what the full effect of this is. There probably is some evidence that there might be some levelling off of the shock that we are going to experience over the next week. But the damage that is going to be done, I think, is yet to be felt. And I think lots of people are very, very worried.
Yeah, and also the sort of strange messages coming, not mixed signals necessarily, but if we look at the Metro, Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Now, he was speaking, I think, at a rally of right-wing, quite radical right-wing party in Italy, and he was mentioning a sort of tariff-free zone with Europe. So, again, Tim, talk us through this and what Elon Musk's role in all of this might be.
Well, you never know entirely what Elon Musk's role is, but of course there were reports, I think, was it Politico that broke the story at the end of last week that he might be leaving the administration? And you can only do, I think, 120 days in his current role anyway, because he hasn't got an official sort of Senate approval. But he clearly doesn't support this policy. And, of course, his Tesla cars are already doing quite badly in Europe, partly because of association with his politics in America, perhaps his politics in Italy. And he clearly thinks that this tariffs policy is wrong. So the FT story may be that the administration as a whole is solid, but Elon Musk may sort of be a canary in the coal mine, really, warning, is this really the policy that you want? And there are signs of certain countries. Taiwan, for example, has lifted its tariffs today and said it's not going to have any more tariffs with America. I think it's something we should consider in Britain. You know, we have 10% tariffs. Get rid of them. Call Donald Trump's bluff. Because if we are going to start reducing tariffs, he will then have to probably take off the tariffs on us if it's going to be a fair policy. So you led, Barbara, with the whole emphasis on the British government trying to bail our industry out. Maybe we should bail them out by getting rid of the tariffs and having the tariffs lifted on us in return.
So what have you made of the government's reaction?
Well, I think this is really interesting because I think this tells you Musk's reaction and his suggestion that he wants to see, you know, kind of this frictionless trade between Europe and the US. It's not only indicative of the splits in, potentially the splits in Trump's team, but I think it's also indicative of the wider splits, not only in the Republican Party, but in Trump's America. You know, what we have here is the kind of protectionist, kind of Rust Belt part of the US that wants to see America manufacturing restored and you know, might back a kind of Trumpian isolationist approach. And then there are not only a portion of the Republican Party, but Americans who understand that we are a globalised economy and the US was leading in that. And to suddenly move away from that, I think would be very, very disastrous for the world order and for America. So, but we're seeing this play out. And I think what was really going to happen is when these tariffs were introduced, and there were lots of questions of whether Trump would actually ever go through with it. But now they are playing out. I think we might see those splits unravel very, very quickly, because actually this is a fundamental question of America and what America is as well.
But I suppose that leaves us sort of looking to the US and just waiting to see what happens there, whereas, you know, all countries need to react in one way or another, which takes us to the Eye. Zoe, that's the story, front page of the Eye, if we can just bring it up. The breaking news, basically, we had a few minutes ago, billed British Starmer to ease petrol car ban in race to shield the UK from trade war. Of course, we're at 10%, but the car industry is at 25% tariff. What do you make of this move by Starmer?
Well, this is really interesting as well, because there has been lots of suggestion that there is almost a friction at the top of the Labour government between Ed Miliband, who is the Energy Secretary, and Rachel Reeves, who is obviously the Chancellor of the Exchequer, about Labour's green push. And you have to remember the green policy was a big part of Labour's offering. It was one of the only kind of real costed parts of their manifesto. Big push from Ed Miliband and lots of people within the core of the Labour Party. But there have been concerns about how that is going to square with Labour's growth ambitions. You know, there's been concerns about energy and the banning of new oil and gas licences, but also electric vehicles. And I think this has given Starmer an opportunity to potentially ease this ban that they may have already been concerned about as one of the measures that you know, part of Labour was pushing for because of their green policies, but another part of Labour was more concerned about because of economic growth and what it would do to industry here.
I think this is a big development, actually. I think we are beginning to see Labour retreat from its green agenda. As Zoe says, it was absolutely one of the big distinctions between the parties at the last election. But we've already seen Kemi Badenoch, the Tory leader, abandon the Tories' commitment to net zero by 2050. She thinks it's unrealistic. Now we have Keir Starmer backing off a little bit about green targets for the car industry to help them. And the fact is, it's just such an expensive commitment at a time when growth is already slow and the British economy... Growth is supposed to be Labour's #1 target. And so there is this real contradiction between hitting that target and probably the policy that Labour activists, Labour supporters most like, which is what Ed Miliband is doing on the green economy. And so this clash with the Green Party waiting in the wings, waiting to hover up any Labour voters that feel disillusioned by a backtracking from green. This is very politically tough for Keir Starmer, but it really goes to the heart of what he wants his government to achieve. And I don't think he's yet chosen, as Zoe says, between what Rachel Reeves wants and what Ed Miliband wants.
OK. Time for one final story here in The Guardian, looking to some international news out of the Middle East. IDF raised Gaza border land to create a kill zone. Of course, the Middle East and what's going on there was in the news with the news of the 2 Labour MPs that were sent back. Zoe, tell us about this story.
Yeah, so this is a pretty extraordinary report collected by a group called Breaking the Silence, which was is Israeli veterans who want to expose the military's grip over Palestine. And The Guardian Guardian have interviewed some of these soldiers as well to corroborate the accounts, but it basically reveals the extent to which Israel was launching this attack on Palestine. So it says that soldiers were given orders to deliberately, methodically and systematically annihilate whatever was within the designated perimeter. And this is inside the perimeter of Gaza, where troops were ordered to turn the area into a kill zone. You know, it's extraordinary reports of the kind of damage and destruction that was sanctioned by the Israeli state. And I think it's going to, you know, we know that there's far more conflicts coming in this region and happening right now. And obviously on the backdrop of these MPs, the Labour MPs refused entry to Israel, and this is going to raise more concerns about Israel, the pressure that the UK is putting on Israel to have a permanent ceasefire in the region.
It also comes a few days after those 50 medics that were killed.
Absolutely.
And the story that the Israeli military gave didn't tally with then what came out the video. What do you make of this story, Tim? And also the story of the two MPs, obviously, Kemi Badenoch saying that Israel was right, and then David Lammy not agreeing.
Well, the two Labour MPs who denied entry, they were incredibly critical of Israel. So I can completely understand why Israel wouldn't want them as guests, because they were only going to cause trouble. Now, but pragmatically, these two MPs have probably now had much more publicity than they ever would have done if Israel had let them in. So while I have a lot of sympathy with Israel's decision, it might have been wiser for them to let them in. They probably wouldn't have been noticed that much. They're not, you know, household names. But now, of course, we're talking about it on Sky's press review. It's been on the front of a lot of newspapers. It's going to be leading a lot of bulletins. But this particular story in The Guardian is pretty alarming. And so Israel will not silence its critics.
Well, it's also worth remembering that no international journalist has been allowed to go into Gaza without being as part of an embed with the IDF. So there's journalists there, and over 100 have died, but no journalists are allowed in. So huge questions about, you know, going in and seeing what's actually happening. Tim, Zoe, stay with us. Coming up, door-to-door medical house calls could return to tackle the health crisis. That's according to tomorrow's Daily Telegraph. Stay with us.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted. She was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts.
What's it like doing this kind of stuff when he's not here?
Yeah, I miss him. He just inspired me to be a better person. He's shown us what living looks like in the toughest and most difficult of circumstances.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks. I've reported from around the world and around the UK. It isn't what politicians see from election battle buses, but what ordinary people see from the buses that shape the timetable of their lives.
I feel like there's no trust between the people and the politicians.
Labour's going to get in definitely, and they're no better than the Conservatives.
It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next.
Ida has certainly left its mark on New Orleans.
It just feels heartbreaking.
Cartels in Mexico are flooding America with the drug.
We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal.
Sky News, the full story first.
Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Very good morning to you all.
Morning.
Do you regret the tweet, Gary?
There's no sign, publicly at least, of either side being willing to give ground. Brianna's dad told Sky News what he thinks of them.
If I'm honest, I hate them. They're just evil. They'll always be monsters.
Free wherever you get your news. How do you reassure the public that all of these mistakes wouldn't be made again?
God forbid we should have to do this again.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Tim Montgomerie and Zoe Grunewald. OK, let's start with the Daily Telegraph. And their main story there, door-to-door NHS to tackle health crisis. So maybe bringing back house calls. What's the story about?
Yeah, so often when people talk about sort of the glory days of the NHS, they tend to talk about the family doctor. And this is one of the new initiatives from Labour, which is part of their push to get people back to work and sort of get through the backlog, which is a plan to have a kind of, they call it an army of health workers who will be sent door to door to help kind of get people who are sick or, you know, prevent them from being sick and get them the healthcare that they need, rather than just kind of expecting them to turn up at a GP surgery or, you know, A&E, which is obviously where we see those acute pressures. And this is a community health worker model that was seen in Brazil and is now going to be modelled here in the UK. And the idea is that you'll have health workers who have a particular kind of patch and they visit various households in that patch. Sounds like an interesting idea. Obviously, the big question is resources. That's the question the NHS always has. Do we have the staff? Do we have the money? Do we have the resources to do something like this? But I think this is an interesting part of Labour's preventative healthcare work. You know, if people can get healthcare before they need to end up in those acute services like A&E, like, you know, their GP surgery, could this help get people back to work quicker, stop their conditions from worsening, stop them from getting comorbidities, those kind of things?
Briefly, could it work?
Well, it would, but where's the money coming from this? You know, it's a nice idea in practice, and there's, you know, one little part of this says they're going to start in very disadvantaged areas where perhaps the need is greatest, but I don't quite know what the sound of scoffing is, but I think I should scoff at this point because you know, we're all waiting for basic operations from the NHS. This seems like an expansion of a service when it can't even do the, you know, the day job particularly well. So, yeah, I'm a bit sceptical.
Which leads us to the Daily Mail, another health-related story, and I guess, again, prevention, you know, trying to prevent, I guess, the need often for surgery. 9 out of 10 GPs call for NHS prostate screening programme because it is, I think, one of the most common cancers in the UK, but it's hard to, basically, a lot of men don't go for screening. Zoe?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's absolutely right. We know that it is a kind of a leading cause of cancer in men, and it is something that, you know, historically doesn't have a lot of pick-up early enough because of the kind of the stigma around it. So this is a campaign that's kind of been led by, I believe it's been led by the Mail, which is that they want to see a national prostate cancer screening process because they believe that would help get people screening quicker, catch any disease and get them treatment quicker. So, you know, any kind of initiatives to get people, you know, going and getting checked out as soon as possible always have the backing of doctors, but it's
men are bad at volunteering themselves for these tests, much worse than women. So, and you find that often it's men who in married setups, it's the wives that will often prompt them to get. So, trying to attack that fairly by men to go for tests and that. This seems like a good initiative. But again, it's another expansion of NHS service when it's struggling to do basic. So I think we all think prevention is a better idea because it will save in the long run. But it's just being able to afford that initial investment, that's the trouble.
Final story, Telegraph, bottom of the page, Marine Le Pen. Now, she spoke in Paris today, I think her first rally since basically she got found guilty of embezzlement, and she likened the court's decision to disqualify her for running from the French presidency to Martin Luther King's Jr. civil rights struggle. There's not a lot of people, in fairness, possibly even supporters of Le Pen, who would put the two together.
What you suggested, but
go on. Well, what do you think?
No, look, we thought we looked for an Anne Finally story, don't we? Something to make us giggle. And this is probably the closest we could get. It's just the idea of her sort of using Martin Luther King is obviously part of her attempt to modernise the image of the National Front in France. But I think there might have been a few of her supporters scratching their heads and thinking, why are we comparing ourselves to Martin Luther King? But the other interesting thing about the rally, sort of just surfing the internet today, was the crowd was good in sort of vertical, but not massive. Yeah. No, it didn't even quite fill the location that they'd anticipated. So, and the polls haven't really given her the bounce that I think she thought she might get from what they betrayed.
There's a lot of people, because there's an appeal, obviously, I think, next year. So possibly, if she wins that, she could still run. But people thought this might even be them not making of her, she's made already, but, you know, could really push her to the presidency.
Yeah, because we've seen how historically these have helped leaders of this kind of particular political persuasion. I mean, Donald Trump, for example, obviously his conviction...
As he mentioned himself.
Yes, but I think what is really interesting about this, and this particular comparison, which I think a lot of people will be scratching their heads at, is that it didn't seem like the party were particularly prepared for this conviction. And I think some of their messaging and the polls as well that you pointed out, Tim, have reflected this. It seems that they're sort of scrabbling around a bit and they're not really sure where to go to next. You know, is Jordan Bardella going to kind of take over the mantle? And is he really prepared to do that?
He's only 27.
29.
29. OK, so that's still young.
Very old, very old.
We're going to have to leave it there. Tim, Zoe, thank you so much. I'll see you in the next hour. Now let's take a quick look at the weather.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, it's looking mostly fine this week, likely turning more unsettled over the weekend. Expect a few changes, however, as high pressure over the North Sea sinks south, changing the wind direction. There'll be a mostly calm, sunny but chilly start tomorrow with an extensive frost or ground frost out of town and a few fog patches, but the Northern Isles will be rather grey. Any fog will lift quite readily during the morning, leaving almost unbroken sunshine for most, but the far north will stay quite cloudy. Inland areas will become warm in the sunshine and it will turn a little warmer near many eastern coasts. It won't be as windy as today.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. Qatar Airways sponsors the weather.